Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Robert Pape, a visiting lecturer from the University of Chicago. Robert Pape will be speaking on the topic of Dying to Win, the strategic logic of suicide terrorism, which is also the title of a book he authored published in 2005. Robert Pape did his undergraduate work at the University of Pittsburgh and earned his PhD from the University of Chicago before returning to his alma mater to teach, that is his graduate alma mater. He taught international relations at Dartmouth College and air power strategy at the United States Air Force School of Advanced Air Power Studies. He's an associate professor of political science and the founder and director of the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism. This project is funded in part by the Carnegie Corporation and the Pentagon. Robert Pape is also the author of the book Bombing to Win, published in 1996. His commentaries on international security policy have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, ABC, CBS, National Public Radio, and elsewhere. And we're absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming and making the effort to be on the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve.
So your earlier work was on air power, and how and when did you make the shift to terrorism?
Well, it actually happened on 9/11 itself. Because of my work on air power, on 9/11, you might remember there were lots of technical questions having to do with how many casualties occurred on that day. Well, I was brought on a lot of media shows that night to answer those questions. Not really questions about terrorism, but what casualty estimates could we make? And since I knew a fair bit about how we would do that with air power, I could say that, well, with a cruise missile attack, what you would normally do to estimate the casualties in a building would be you'd look at the floor the cruise missile hit, assume the fire would have consumed that floor, and that most people above that point would probably not be able to survive, and those below probably would have a fair chance to survive. And so that allowed me to make an estimate that we would lose somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people in those attacks. And of course, as time's gone on, it's fortunately been at the lower end of that estimate. But in the course of those interviews, I was asked also lots of questions about the origins of suicide terrorism. And the fact is, I quickly discovered that we had very weak information to answer those questions, partial and thin data at best about suicide terrorist attacks. And I found myself collecting some of that data, and after the interviews ended, I realized this would be a very useful thing to do. And so I found myself just almost without thinking about it, collecting the first complete set of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world from 1980 through early 2004.
And how long has suicide terrorism been around?
Oh, actually, for thousands of years. The very first suicide attackers are the Jewish zealots in Zachari in the 1st century A.D. The Jewish zealots were under Roman occupation, and they were trying to foment a rebellion among the Jewish population against their Roman occupiers. Well, what the zealots would do is they would go up to a legion of Roman soldiers, pull out a knife, slit the throat of one of the Roman soldiers, and then the other Roman soldiers would stab or spear that person to death. And those attackers knew that would happen, but they were hoping that they would be able to foment a rebellion or an insurrection with that process. And in fact, that did lead to the Jewish War of 66 AD, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple and the diaspora that had occurred. So those really were successful. It was successful in producing the revolt, but not so successful in terms of producing the outcome that they had been hoping for.
Were there, say, theological background for what these early Jews did?
Well, actually, it was quite controversial, much like today, where you have some suicide terrorists doing it for religious purposes who are actually stretching and changing the mainstream understanding of their religion. Many zealots at the time were not well respected among mainstream Jewish scholars, and in fact, to this day, there's quite a bit of controversy about the appropriateness of the behavior of the zealots, and it just simply remains an extremely controversial episode. Nowhere near, yes, the zealots were claiming that they were partly acting out of out of religious commitment to end an occupation, but that doesn't mean that mainstream understanding of Judaism accepted their behavior as legitimate.
Mm-hmm. And so this phenomenon then is clearly not of suicide terrorism. It's not limited to fundamentalist Islam.
That's exactly right, and that's one of the big things that jumped out of my study. You see, when I collected that database of the suicide attackers from 1980 to early 2004, I ended up studying 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. And the first thing that jumped right out at me is that over half are secular. Mm-hmm. The world leader in suicide terrorism is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They're a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. Over a third of the Muslim suicide terrorist attacks are by secular groups such as the PKK, which is a Kurdish terrorist organization in Turkey, which is also Marxist, that is anti-religion in orientation. And so it's really quite misleading to believe that suicide terrorism is mainly a product of religion or specifically Islamic fundamentalism. That just hasn't been the case.
Of course, it depends what you mean by religion, doesn't it? Because a belief in a kind of ideology, whether it be officially religious or whether it be Marxist, could still take the same form of some action that you perceive somehow is going to have some transformative effect in the world.
You're quite right that an ideology, if it were able to produce suicide terrorism independent of specific circumstances, could take the form of a religion. But in fact, what over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world have in common is not a type of religion or ideology, but a specific strategic goal: to compel modern democracies to withdraw combat forces from territory the terrorists view as their homeland or prize greatly. From Lebanon to Sri Lanka to Chechnya to Kashmir to the West Bank, every suicide terrorist campaign since 1980 has had as its central objective to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms. I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, armored personnel vehicles from territory that the terrorists prize. Yes, many are religious, many are secular, many are communists or socialists who are pursuing, if you would, a secular religion. But outside of that circumstance of the presence of foreign combat forces on territory the terrorists prize, we rarely see suicide terrorism occurring.
So you look at Israel then, in a sense, in precisely this way.
In this way. In fact, suicide terrorism against Israel from the West Bank and from Gaza really begins to take off in the 1990s. And the key thing that's useful for people to know is that Israel occupied those territories starting in 1967, but didn't actually begin to settle the territories with large numbers of Jewish settlers until the 1980s. Today, there are over 400,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. In fact, 200,000 near East Jerusalem and another 200,000 outside of the area of Jerusalem in the West Bank. Well, they really didn't begin to come until the 1980s. As late as 1982, there were only 12,000. And what really began to happen from the mid-1980s on is large numbers of Jewish settlers began to settle in the West Bank, and that began to provoke. It began to provoke first ordinary violence in Intifada with throwing rocks and stones, and then guerrilla war, and then suicide terrorism as an effort to try to end that increasing occupation.
Now, you teach at the University of Chicago, which is kind of famed for its interdisciplinary, I don't know whether it's still the case, the Committee for Social Thought and so on. So have you talked about your theory, say, with people in religious studies?
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you gain anything from that conversation? Because you're saying somehow there's something about people being on your land, in your territory, Western democracies, or somebody that you feel that shouldn't be there, that somehow inspires this.
And in fact, I learned quite a bit from the the great scholars we have at our divinity school, because as I began to make these arguments, I of course didn't know much about the history of martyrdom as it's, say, Christian martyrdom or Jewish martyrdom, and I'm learning about this as I'm doing the basic research. Well, they're telling me, often pointing me and guiding me to the literature, which shows that, in fact, there's a fair bit of similarity in the early martyrs that we note in our own religion, where in the case of both the Jewish martyrs, the Zealots and Zachari, and then the early Christian martyrs, we have cases where they're often acting in opposition to, in both of those cases, Roman occupation. And in fact, in the 2nd and 3rd century, where the Christian martyrs are becoming so prominent, that's really the heyday, if you would, of the large number of Christian martyrs. Many of them are martyring themselves, killing themselves deliberately, as an act of defiance against Roman occupation, often throwing themselves on the spears of Roman soldiers to try to manifest how they're willing to sacrifice their lives to support their religion in opposite, so that it becomes something that is not dominated by Roman occupation or suppressed by Roman occupation.
Well, let me ask you, why did the Pentagon listen to you? I mean, it seems to me, given what you're saying now, the idea of sending a huge military force and presence right in the middle of the Middle East to Iraq is precisely the wrong kind of gesture.
You're absolutely right, and I've not been opposed to all military strategies in the past, but I have been fairly opposed to the war in Iraq precisely because it's exactly the kind of conflict which would produce suicide terrorism. And before our invasion of Iraq in March 2003, Iraq never experienced a suicide terrorist attack in its history. Never. Since then, suicide terrorism has been doubling every year. We've had 140,000 combat troops in the country, and I'm afraid it's right in line with expectations. Well, why didn't they listen? Well, partly it's because the research that I'm doing here, it took a few years to actually publish. It wasn't first published, even as an academic article, until the summer of 2003. Now, yes, I'd actually sent copies of the research to people in the Pentagon before that, but we have to recognize that on 9/11, that's when many of these policies were taken. Even interest in going into Iraq stems from shortly after toppling the Taliban in the fall of 2001, and we have to accept that the fact is we had quite a vacuum of information about what was causing suicide terrorism. Most people believed, and I think this is true not just in the Bush administration, but in the public at large, that suicide terrorism was the product of Islamic fundamentalism, an evil ideology that we should try to wring out of Muslim societies. And I have to admit myself, on 9/11, I kind of reached for the Quran. What's wrong with Islam? And it wasn't really until I put the research together, and it wasn't just me. This involves a research team of 10 people who are fluent in all the key native languages. We really are collecting a rather voluminous amount of new information, and I'm afraid that kind of systematic work, although I really wish it had been there and ready for on 9/11 itself, took some time. And now, in the last 6 months, I've been on Capitol Hill 4 times, speaking to both Republicans and Democrats, senators and representatives.
Are they listening to you now? Are they listening to you now?
Well, many are spending an hour and a half at a crack to really listen to the talks and go through this. And in Washington, probably the best measure of merit is time, because time is just so precious. So for me I've probably addressed 40 of our 535 senators and representatives, as I said, for about an hour and a half. It's extremely unusual for that to ever happen for me. This is the first time in my career that's happened, and it's extremely unusual to have anything more than a few minutes of the time of such busy people. And I've also been to the Department of Defense, where I've given the same sort of a talk for a longer period, say 3 hours, with people who really want to fight with every single issue, to the Office of Force Transformation in the Department of Defense. Well, Rumsfeld, you might know, is famous for transformation. So this is really quite an important part of the Pentagon. And just last week, I was at the National Security Agency, the NSA, the famous people who do all the eavesdropping, which have been recently in the news, to speak to 120 analysts who are doing intelligence on terrorism. And we again spent a 3-hour session where we went over the arguments and the data and the patterns in great, great, great detail. And I think that that really gives you a sense that people are really coming to grips with this. Because it really isn't the case that there's somebody else who has collected the global patterns of suicide terrorism. Many people have studied terrorism.
Which is astonishing.
It is, but it takes a fair bit of effort.
Right.
And in fact, we should recognize that for the last few years, many people in the government, even intelligence officials of all different stripes, have been really focusing on trying to fight the war in Iraq. So they've had a different focus, which we may wish they didn't, but the fact is they have been doing something else. So,
well, let me ask you. So, what now that we have this conflagration happening, which by your own analysis can only get worse as long as we have the irritant of our presence, or the U.S. presence and the so-called coalition presence there. How do you move forward from this point?
Well, we certainly can't just stay the course. And we also can't simply cut and run. Iraq is not Vietnam because of oil. We have an interest in access to oil in the Persian Gulf, and that's why at the end of the book I develop a new strategy. It's a true new strategy. It's not simply a Democratic strategy, and it's not simply a Republican strategy. In fact, I've had a nice letter from Bill Clinton about this, and I've had nice comments from Dick Lugar, a Republican senator, about this, which is to go toward a new strategy called offshore balancing. This is a strategy that we should implement not quickly. We shouldn't just cut and run and draw down forces overnight, but over a 3 or 4 year period, including starting just this year, we should systematically withdraw forces, ground combat forces from the Arabian Peninsula, and move toward this other strategy of offshore balancing to secure our interest in oil. Well, offshore balancing is having forces poised at the ready offshore to enter if we need to secure our interest in oil. And in fact, it's the strategy we pursued for decades before 1990. Even many experts don't remember that before 1990, the United States secured its interest in oil in the Arabian Peninsula without stationing a single combat soldier on the Arabian Peninsula. Yes, advisors with a few sidearms at some embassies, but no tanks, fighter aircraft, or APCs going all the way back to World War II. We hadn't done it at all. Well, that strategy relies on having a good alliance with Iraq and Saudi Arabia, which we can do again. It relies on having aircraft carriers off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and air power today is even more effective than 30 years ago. And it relies on having bases on the Arabian Peninsula, bases without troops, but bases so that we could rapidly deploy troops in a crisis.
But if we have bases, then we're there.
No.
You mean the offshore?
In the 1980s, we had the reason we could, in 1990, before 1990, we had no combat soldiers on the Arabian Peninsula. But remember, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and within 6 months, we had over 500,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Arabian Peninsula.
So we could say that that's, in a sense, what, from your analysis, was the final irritant for Osama bin Laden.
That we stayed.
In a sense, the first Gulf War.
It wasn't so much that we went there in 1990 as we never left.
That's what I mean. Then we had the troops that didn't go. So excuse me for interrupting you. So, but where are these bases going to be? I don't quite understand. If you're not on the land,
we don't actually.
You're offshore. You're offshore.
No, the bases can be the same bases we have currently. And in fact, in the 1980s, the reason we could move the forces in 1990 so quickly is we had built the bases in the 1980s. All the airfields in Saudi Arabia, when were they built? When was all that concrete laid down? In the 70s and 80s, with no American fighters, no American aircraft, and in fact, no hardly any pre-positioned equipment. Just having the bare bones infrastructure of the bases made it possible for us to rapidly redeploy our ground forces And in fact, we have virtually the basic infrastructure we need. So once we remove our ground combat forces from Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula over, say, a 3 or 4 year period of time, we really have the basic structure we need.
But why wouldn't Osama bin Laden and that crowd be just as angry about having the possibility of I mean, if you've got the bases, then I mean, why wouldn't they say we just want to get rid of the possibility of that?
They may well do that, but what we see in the patterns of suicide terrorism since 1980 is that suicide terrorists are overwhelmingly walk-in volunteers who are not longtime members of the organization, and they're joining typically just a few months or even just a few weeks to do their actual suicide attack, and their core motive, there's some variation, but their core motive is to cause combat forces that are sitting right now on the territory to leave that territory. And so absent that situation, we rarely see terrorist leaders able to mobilize support for their plans.
So you're saying the reason is not in and of itself then fundamental Islam, because there's a political goal to it. Isn't that part of your argument?
Exactly right.
Yeah. But it certainly feeds very strongly into religious ideology. I mean, give us a sense of the mind of one of these terrorists who's recruited. Give me a sense of what's going on in that person's mind and how the terrorist organizations recruit these people.
We see 3 individual patterns in the individual motivations of suicide terrorists. Some are clearly interested in social prestige, which is why they make martyr videos or do it with friends, do it as part of friendship groups. The Hebron soccer team, for instance, 4 of the members of the Hebron soccer team conducted suicide terrorist attacks on the West Bank in the Second Intifada just 2 years ago. The second pattern we see is the desire for personal revenge against combat forces that have killed either close family members or close friends of the individual. And last November, you might remember that the woman, there were suicide attacks in Jordan. Well, one suicide attacker, her bomb didn't go off, and it was a woman who gave some very poignant interviews afterwards explaining that she had lost 3 brothers in Fallujah in Iraq. She was an Iraqi. She lost 3 brothers in Fallujah during the American assault on Fallujah, and in fact, she was interested in some revenge. And she seemed to show no remorse whatsoever. The third pattern we see are religious. There are religious suicide attackers. I don't mean to deny that, but what cuts across all 3 of those patterns is deep anger at the presence of foreign combat forces that on territory the terrorists prize. And absent that common motive, we rarely see those other individual patterns producing suicide terrorism on their own.
Right. So you're not persuaded by these arguments that somehow it's poverty in the Arab world, for example?
Well, in the front end of the book, I look at this pretty closely. If it were poverty that were driving suicide terrorism, then we would expect to see the poorest countries in the world generating suicide terrorists. And of the 180 countries that the World Bank tracks, we see virtually no suicide terrorism among the poorest 40 countries in the world. That is the bottom 20%. And in fact, many of the countries, although they're nowhere near as rich as the United States, that are producing suicide terrorism are actually you'd almost call them middle income countries. And then when we look at the income profile of the actual suicide terrorists, this pattern becomes even more revealing. You see, when we study those 462 suicide terrorists, especially for the Arab attackers, we're able to collect quite rich socioeconomic data about the actual attackers. Once you penetrate the language barrier, you can really gain a lot of information. Well, it turns out, especially for the Arab attackers from Lebanon and Palestine and Al-Qaeda, people are so interested in, it turns out that the suicide attackers are overwhelmingly middle class or working class, very rarely from the bottom of their society. So in the case of the Arab attackers, only about 15% are from the bottom of their societies or unemployed, compared to a third in the surrounding societies of Lebanon and Palestine as a whole. 76% are working class or middle class, compared to just a fraction in their societies as a whole. They're technicians, teachers, ambulance drivers, security guards. In fact, if we also look at education, we can see that only a small fraction, actually just about 10% of Arab suicide attackers have only primary education or less. In fact, nearly 40% have secondary education, compared to just a trivial fraction in their surrounding societies. So whether we look at the economics of the country as a whole, or whether we actually look at the economics of the individual suicide attackers, what we see are suicide attackers are not the wretched of the earth. They're not the people that have so little to live for they'll throw their lives away easily. I'm afraid to say it's quite startlingly the opposite, which is that they're actually quite productive members of their community who you would expect to go on to lead relatively productive lives if they hadn't chosen to do a suicide attack.
So somehow the reform of Islam then is not going to be the answer, at least not in the short run. We've got to get our troops out of there. And isn't there something else the United States can do and the Western world can do, especially the United States, which is to become less dependent upon oil itself?
Absolutely.
Have you been? Do you think this had anything to do with Bush's speech that's suddenly sort of coming out of nowhere?
Well, it's
absolutely out of nowhere, saying we need to become oil independent. To me, it was striking.
It may well have, but what I can tell you is that in one of the first trips I made to Capitol Hill, Richard Lugar, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was there for an hour and a half, and he actually stayed for the whole thing, waited to the very end, and he said he just wanted to ask me one question, which was energy independence. Would this help? And I said, absolutely it would help, but we have to get there. And this is, energy independence is something we should be moving toward so that we could achieve it by 2020, 2025, but we still have a 15 or 20 year window where we need to respond now. And so what I would say is you're absolutely right that offshore balancing should be our strategy maybe for 15 years. It's a strategy we can hold on, not just by our fingernails, but for about a 15-year window. And then if we can replace that by an even better strategy of energy independence, that's super.
Well, it's been very stimulating talking to you about this extraordinarily important issue. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Robert Pape, who is an expert on terrorism. Thanks very much for watching.